Namaste and a warm welcome to the Ex-Christian Show, the insider view of Christianity from the outside. Today we have with us former pastor and church leader, David Ramsey. For 10 years, David was a Baptist minister and he holds degrees from Wake Forest University, Duke University, and he was named a fellow in religion and leadership development at Princeton Theological Seminary. His sermons appeared frequently in national clergy journals and religious publications, and David has served on numerous civic and religious boards. After spending nearly 10 years studying religion at prestigious academic institutions, including Duke and Princeton, and spending a decade as a Baptist minister, David experienced a crisis of faith and walked away from ministry. He authored a book called Speaking of God, We Don't Know Bleep. It's a candid, witty, and stimulating book in which David invokes biblical scholarship, human psychology, classic philosophy, and modern literature, as well as common sense and his personal experience, all of this to critically examine religion. He traces the journey of his own doubt from the foundation of Christianity to the very existence of God. After all that, he switched careers, and he is currently a principal with the world's largest online retail and cloud technology company, Amazon. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Esther. Glad to be here.
So you said that the resurrection of Jesus was the linchpin of your core belief system. And you also said that you fiercely defended resurrection in a paper in class. What changed, David?
Yeah, it was the academic study of Christianity and specifically the New Testament. I was taking a class at Duke under a professor who would later become a mentor and friend, Dr. Dhanraj. And Vaya introduced the class to the writings of Rudolf Bultmann. Bultmann was a German scholar who believed that in order to properly understand the New Testament, you had to scrape away the layers of myth that had attended to the story over the years to find existential meaning. And that challenged me because the resurrection of Jesus for me was central to my belief system. And I would argue for many Christians today. And so I fiercely defended the paper in a class, appealing to biblical scholarship. And so the argument for the historicity of the empty tomb goes something like this. If you were making the story up, you would not have had women at the tomb. The testimony of women was inadmissible in a Roman court. You would have placed Roman centurions at the tomb because that story would have been much more credible. In the Greek, in that Mark 16, 1-8, the very last word is gar, which is a preposition for. And even in the Koine Greek of that time, ending a sentence with a preposition would have been a grammatical faux pas. So I defended Jesus' resurrection in that class. The problems, though, on the other side of the story are simply this. The earliest writings of the New Testament, as you know, Esther, from your studies at Luther Rice, are not the Gospels. They're the writings of Paul. So Paul, writing sometime around 50 AD in 1 Corinthians 15, in which he fiercely defends the resurrection of Jesus, cites what many believe was an ancient hymn or tradition that Christ was buried, or he died, he was buried and raised on the third day. But there's something conspicuous by its absence, and that's the lack of the empty tomb story. So why is this a problem? We don't see the empty tomb story until about 25 years later in Mark's gospel. So the dating of the New Testament is a settled matter for the most part among New Testament scholars, and Mark's gospel is believed to be the earliest, written around 70 AD. So you have Paul writing in, say, 50 AD, doesn't mention the empty tomb. Mark tells the story some 25 years later. Why doesn't Paul reference the empty tomb? Is he unaware of the story? How could a story of that significance be unknown to Paul? Or did Paul not consider the empty tomb story to be necessary for his argument? that would be like a prosecuting attorney having the smoking gun, fingerprints, and DNA and saying, I don't need to introduce those into evidence. My case will rest upon witnesses or appearances. Or, and here's the scholarly rub, had the story not yet been invented. And to take that a step further, Esther, as you know, there were other divine men in that time and place. Jesus was not the only one. And those men had elements in their narratives that were really table stakes. The first was a miraculous birth. The second was miracles during life. And the third was something miraculous post-death. So if Jesus wanted to sit at the table, and more specifically, if his followers wanted Jesus to have a seat at the table as a divine man or God, you had to have those elements in that narrative. And so after years of thinking about this and studying further, I came to the conclusion that that story was myth. And with that, the rest of my faith began to fall apart.
Interesting journey. So you suggested something called Ramsey Theory in your book. What is it about?
Yeah, so the Ramsey Theory is in opposition to Pascal's wager theory. Esther, I think you're aware of that. But for your audience, Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, said, why not take a gamble and believe? Because if you're right, then you have an infinite reward in heaven. If you're wrong, that there is no God, you've wasted nothing. You've wasted no time. And the Ramsey theory goes something like this. If there is a God, and that God, that same God created me with a brain with which to think, and if that God can't handle my intellectual rigor and my intellectual honesty, then that's not much of a God, I would maintain. That's a small God, and that's a very insecure God. So at the end of the day, I made, I guess, peace with either the God that does exist, doesn't exist, to say, you know who I am. You know that I gave about 10 good earning years of my life believing in you. I no longer can. And maybe I'm wrong, but I can't force my mind. I can't wrap it into pretzels, believing things that I know to be false, and in some cases, egregiously so.
Yeah, to be very precise, you said in calling the Christian God insecure, this is what you said in your book. Insecure and maladjusted parent who needs medication and therapy more than unbridled praise and worship. So do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, that's taken from a chapter. I believe the title of that chapter is The Wide-Eyed Worship of an Insecure God. And I start that chapter by creating a scenario, and I ask the reader to imagine a child being summoned to her parents' living room. And the parent says, here's the deal. Every week at this appointed time, you're going to come in front of me. You're going to praise me. You're going to worship me. You're going to exalt me. You're going to confess your sins, everything you've done wrong, all of them to me, and I will forgive you. Then you will write a sermon or a homily about, yes, me. And then we will do that again next week and the next. And so I then pivot from that to say, imagine what an outsider would say looking at that kind of parent. They would say, wow, that's a pretty insecure parent. And I think that child will also find something problematic with that. Well, my argument is that's what a Christian or Jewish worship service looks like. At an appointed time, everyone gathers. They tell this God how wonderful he is, how great he is. They love this God. They sing hymns to him. They confess their sins. And then a homily or a sermon is delivered, usually centered on, guess who? God. And every week, week in and week out, that process continues. Lather, rinse, repeat. And I would say, looking at that objectively, if that is how God operates, that to me is, in fact, a very insecure God, very maladjusted. And if there is, medicine or drugs in heaven, that God probably needs to get on it.
Yeah, I like that. And there's one particular chapter that my attention was drawn to. It actually put me to tears. and because I can totally relate to that. And this chapter is titled, It Was His Time to Go. So let me give you a little background to this. So I lost my brother when he was 21, and we were only 14 months apart, and I was very close to him. It was a great blow to my entire family, and we were relatively new converts at that time. And we converted from Hinduism to Christianity. And the only way we as a family made sense of the loss was by telling ourselves it was his time to go. We literally said that it was his time to go, really at 21. And what was even a morose justification was, God did the right thing by taking him away. If my brother had survived whatever organ failure he underwent that night, he would have become a vegetable. So God loved our family so much that instead of leaving us a vegetable, a bedridden sibling, son, he chose to take him away. And never once did it occur to us, why even have an organ failure? Why couldn't God prevent the organ failure? Why couldn't that night be a miracle night where all his ailments that he had suffered right from his childhood miraculously vanished? We were actually trying to protect God, if you will. So what is this tendency of Christians?
First of all, that's such a sad story, Esther, and I'm sorry for your loss.
Yeah, thank you.
And it's actually also part of my story. My dad died when I was 12, and he was 46. I heard some of the same things. In response to what is behind this, I think that people like to think that God is in control of the world, and that there are no accidents, and that chance does not govern. And to your point, they will go to great lengths to defend God and to defend that worldview, because to think otherwise is to allow for the possibility that chance does in fact govern our lives. And I don't think you need to look very far to see that that is actually true. Esther, you know as well as I, we see billboards and signs that say God is in control. That's kind of the second cousin, I think, to It Was His Time to Go. And when I see those, it's almost laughable, because I'm thinking, really, God is in control? I would really hate with COVID-19. Really, that looks kind of out of control to me. Auschwitz, God is in control? No, I'm going to argue with you there. And then back to It Was His Time to Go. That sentiment may ring true for someone who's reached the age of 85 or 90. Past the age beyond which actuaries estimate lives. But when you're talking about a 6-year-old child who dies and someone says it was his time to go, that rings hollow and is actually very cruel. And in my book, I say you can't cherry pick with this saying of it was his time to go, because either every death is predetermined, the manner and instance and timing of the death is predetermined, or it isn't. And if it is predetermined, then that places God's hands on the furnace doors at Auschwitz, on the yokes of the airliners that crashed into the World Trade Centers, and at the bedside of parents grieving for a 6-year-old child. And if that is in fact God, that is not a God. That is a monster. And I have no desire to worship, follow, or love a monster.
True. Yeah. You talked a little bit about the calling, the divine calling of pastors, and is it really a divine calling, or is there some other purpose that they feel they are called?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do talk about that in my book, and I did, Esther, have a very strong sense of sacred calling when I decided to enter divinity school. Actually, when I entered Duke, it was for the express purpose of getting a PhD in teaching. But while I was there, jobs in religion departments were drying up, cuts were being made across the country. And I was also interning in a Baptist church in Chapel Hill under a very bright, earthy Baptist minister who would occasionally drink, occasionally curse, and who subscribed to the notion wherever there are 3 or 4 Baptists, there should be a 5th. And, I observed him and watched him, and I thought, if I don't have to sacrifice, my peccadillos, I think I might be fit for a call in ministry. And I did. I shifted my focus away from pursuing a PhD to a ministerial track. And so I entered ministry with that sense of calling. So that's one piece to that. But in the Baptist church, Esther, when ministers and churches talk about calling or God calling, in my book, I argue that it's more than a bit disingenuous. Because let me tell you how the calling system works in a Baptist church. And I'll ask you this question. Have you ever heard of God calling a Baptist minister to a smaller church making less money? Kind of interesting how it works, isn't it? God always calls Baptist ministers to larger churches making more money. Now, in the rare cases where ministers move to smaller churches, I would argue that there's something there. There's a history, there's a context. So when I was leaving my first congregation for my second, which would be a larger church, making more money, I told my congregation, maybe God is in this. But let me ask you this, and I posed the question to them, have you ever heard God calling a Baptist minister to a smaller church making less money? And after the service, an older Virginia gentleman with a classic Southern drawl said, Dave, I'm so glad you didn't give us that bullshit about God calling you to that church. And I said, maybe God is in it, but I think you're in on the canard. I will tell you this, Esther, I, for the most part, was fulfilled in my career as a minister. I enjoyed the acts of ministry. I enjoyed reading and writing and preparing sermons and delivering sermons. And I was very methodical. I would start on Monday, with a blank sheet of paper. And by Friday, I had a manuscript. On Saturday, I would commit it to memory. And on Sunday, I would take nothing into the pulpit, no notes, no manuscript, because I had committed it to memory. And I received praise and recognition for those skills. I enjoyed being with people in the liminal moments of life, including death. There was something very powerful about being present with people in those times. And I felt that I had a gift to offer there, having lost my own father when I was 12. And there were certainly some more unsavory things about ministry that I didn't enjoy. And those included the pressure of growing a congregation numerically and financially, which most ministers face. But on balance, I felt that I was equipped to be an effective minister. And I think for the most part, I was. I think both of my congregations would, put me in the beloved status. I think I was liked and respected, certainly not by everyone, but by most. But as I moved from, the worldview that I entered ministry with to a more agnostic worldview, I could no longer do it. It, for me, became a sacrifice of my personal integrity and intellect. And I walked away, and started my life over at the age of 35.
So you said that you enjoyed being a preacher. You enjoyed the reading, preparing for sermons, and the entire process. So did you ever preach to your congregation about tithing?
I did, Esther, and almost every minister that I'm aware of at some point in the church year preaches a sermon, not necessarily on tithing, but on stewardship, because once a year churches come together to talk about the budget for the next year, and they're asking members to make pledges of what they're going to give, so that you can figure out, what programs can and can't be included. When I would talk about tithing, though, Esther, I would not follow the kind of traditional, you must give 10% of what you make. Because in my experience, I knew people for whom 10% of whatever they had or were making would have put them at peril, at financial peril. It would not have been a smart move. I knew others for whom 10% would be like finding change under a couch cover. I talked more about the spirit of giving And I'll give you a great example. In my first congregation, I had a member who was an heiress to the Anheuser-Busch family. She was Sally Bush Wheeler. I believe it was either her grandfather or great-grandfather who was Augie. They had a sprawling horse farm with their corporate and their private stables, including the carriages, two or three carriages, which Clydesdales pulled. They actually funded my Princeton study and education. I used to tell my peers at Princeton that I was there on Budweiser money. But by contrast, I had two sisters, older sisters, lived together, and they lived on the fringe of poverty. And for them, 10% of whatever they had would have been not only reckless, it would have been downright cruel for anyone to expect them to give 10% of anything. So I talked more about the spirit of giving. I talked about why we do it. And I was very frank. I said, we do have programs that we fund. Most of the money, though, in most churches goes to salaries and for staff members. And that's not a judgment. It's more of an observation. And I remember one year standing in front of my second congregation and saying, look, we're asking you to make pledges for the coming year. And, we do some really good things with what you give. But let me face it, I'm up here asking you to support me and my family, my associate minister and his family, our secretary, our minister of music for another year. And there's nothing wrong with that because that is how churches are run. But yeah, I would annually preach, whether you want to call it tithing or stewardship, that kind of sermon.
So stewardship is a fancy name given to tithing. Don't you agree?
It is. You could also make the argument it is a bit disingenuous. I think it follows from the notion that I don't believe in anymore, that, God has entrusted his creation to you, including, church matters, and we're called to be good stewards, of those resources and of those matters. I no longer believe that. And even when I was doing it, my cynical side viewed church kind of like a business. And let's face it, at the end of the day, at least in my experience, churches expect their minister to grow the congregation numerically and financially. And if you don't do that, it can be very uncomfortable, for you. And I've even, stories where ministers are asked to leave. And in the Baptist church, when you leave, you don't have a landing spot because there's no hierarchy. There's no denominational organization to take care of you. Unlike the Methodist church, if there's pastor-parish conflict, a superintendent comes in, tries to deal with a conflict. If it can't be resolved, that minister simply moves to another church and someone comes in behind him or her. The Baptist church, it doesn't work that way. And so at the end of the day, a church is a lot like a business. Churches use the language of evangelism and saving souls, but it is all about, to be very crude and to use, football coaching jargon, it's about putting butts in seats. And I had a church member in my second congregation use that language. We pay you to put butts in seats every Sunday.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I had a church member in my second congregation who compared the job of a minister to that of a college football coach who gets paid to put butts in seats, to bring people into the stadium to watch the athletic contest. And I'll tell you this, Esther. So, I left the ministry at the age of 35. I started my life over. I got into the burgeoning field of technology sales. And I've had, some very high pressure jobs with, multi-million-dollar responsibilities. In any given year, I make between 10 and 15 times my best year of ministry. Let me just put that in. I make between 10 and 15 times my best year in ministry, but I have 1/10 of the pressure that I felt as a minister. The pressures are incomparable. I sleep at night, and I've slept at night soundly ever since walking away from ministry. In that respect, it is, in fact, like a business, and church members deny it all day long. But you show me a congregation whose membership is in decline and has been in decline for years, and I'll show you a pulpit where a minister has tremendous anxiety because of those pressures.